traffic stop for something as simple as unpaid tolls. A car suddenly starts to move. An officer makes a split-second decision to jump on its side. The whole thing, this fatal encounter, was over in just 5 seconds. But those 5 seconds led to a unanimous Supreme Court decision that is completely changing how police use of force is judged in this country. Okay, so this all starts with a case called Barnes versus Felix. It was a traffic stop just outside of Houston where things went from 0 to 100 with, breathtaking speed. Just take a look at this timeline. At the 0-second mark, Ashton Barnes' car starts rolling forward. Literally 1 second later, Officer Felix is on the doorsill. By second 3, he's fired his weapon. And by the 5-second mark, it's all over. The entire critical life-or-death sequence happened in the time it took me to say that sentence. But here's the thing. When this case first went to court, the legal analysis didn't cover those 5 seconds. No. Instead, it focused only on these two, that tiny window between the officer jumping on the car and firing his shot. In the eyes of the law at that time, everything that happened before, well, it was considered irrelevant. So why? Why would a court put on what the Supreme Court later called chronological blinders? Well, it's all because of a very specific legal standard they were using. So, this all comes down to the Fourth Amendment, which I'm sure you know protects us from unreasonable searches and seizures. And a police officer using force is legally considered a seizure. But the key word there is reasonable. What exactly does reasonable mean? That is the entire debate at the heart of this case. The lower court, which was the Fifth Circuit, used this very specific test to figure that out. It's called the moment of threat rule. And yeah, it does pretty much exactly what it sounds like. It freezes time and only looks at that single isolated moment when an officer feels their life is in danger. As the Fifth Circuit itself put it, their whole focus was confined to that one single moment. The instant Officer Felix was hanging off a moving car. And the court's logic was, in that instant, could a reasonable officer fear for his life? They said yes, so the shooting was justified. End of story. This slide just lays out the central conflict perfectly. On one side, you have the moment of threat rule, which is like a tight, freeze-frame snapshot. And on the other, you have the totality of the circumstances, which is more like the wide-angle view, taking in the entire story, including everything that led up to that final moment. So let's get to the Supreme Court. They heard this case and unanimously, completely rejected that freeze-frame approach. Justice Kagan wrote the opinion for the court, and she used this really powerful metaphor. She said that a court just can't do its job if it puts on chronological blinders. Basically, if it refuses to look at everything that happened before those final critical seconds. And this is the crucial point. The Supreme Court said context isn't just nice to have, it is mandatory. Courts now must look at the entire chain of events, the reason for the stop, the choices made, the whole interaction, to decide if the final use of force was truly reasonable. To really drive this point home, the court pointed to one of its own previous cases. In that case, Plumhoff v. Rickard, they had found a shooting was justified, but it was because the driver had led police on this long and outrageously reckless high-speed chase. The whole point was, you can't just ignore the chase when you're looking at the final seconds. The history of the whole interaction is critical. But the court was also very, very precise here. It answered one huge question about timing, but it was super careful to leave another, equally tough question totally unanswered. And this is really the elephant in the room, right? What happens when an officer's own choices, in this case the decision to jump onto a moving car, are arguably the very thing that created the moment of threat in the first place? The court explicitly ducked this question. They basically said because the lower courts were so zoomed in on those 2 seconds, they never legally analyzed whether Officer Felix's own earlier actions were a factor. And since that analysis never happened below, the Supreme Court couldn't rule on it. So they kicked that can down the road for a future case. Okay, so with that big question still hanging out there, what's the clear, practical takeaway from this really landmark ruling? The bottom line is this. The moment of threat rule is officially dead. From now on, any court looking at a police use of force claim has to look at the whole picture. It means the analysis has to be way more nuanced, way more fact-dependent, and much more sensitive to the full context of what happened. And, while the decision was unanimous, a concurring opinion from Justice Kavanaugh adds a really critical layer of context here, and that's the real-world pressure that officers are under in these exact moments. He really emphasizes that even a routine traffic stop is, in his words, fraught with danger. And when a driver tries to flee, those risks just multiply instantly. An officer is forced to make a life or death judgment in just a matter of seconds, with, as he put it, no easy or risk-free answers. And that's really where this ruling leaves us. The Supreme Court has mandated a wider lens, a full-story approach. But every single story of force is going to contain a moment where a decision was made in a fraction of a second. The new, really difficult challenge for the courts, and for all of us, is figuring out exactly how to balance those two truths.